Good day, Claude Lawrenson here. We're going to talk today about accessibility and ramp construction. When we look at this photo, we see a barrier-free ramp that's going up to the house. I'm going to talk a little bit about ramp construction and certainly what would be deemed good building practice for barrier-free ramps. When we look at the design and construction of ramps, the building codes in Canada, and equally so, those in the USA, provide us with the minimum accepted construction standards. Although this is a barrier-free ramp and it looks pretty darn good and fairly well built, it does not truly meet the code standard. There are a few minor things, but overall, it's a pretty good ramp. Our topic on this webinar is what is required to meet the building code standard, more specifically the National Building Code of Canada. Although there might be slight variations in provincial building codes, typically the National Building Code is recognized as the primary building code, particularly for federally funded projects. Here's one example. Look at the graspability of the handrails. Otherwise, it complies with building code. If we start from the exterior, we need to consider the pathway to the ramp. It is common in most every home that there will be a grade difference from the grade level or ground level right up to the main entrance door to a home. Exterior pathways should be designed to ensure comfort and safety of all persons, really regardless of age or ability. All pathways should be free of obstacles and provide easy access to the main entry to the house. If we take a look, we can see here is a little bit of, we'll call it detail or specifications for that pathway. Ideally, a minimum of 43 inches in width. Grades should be accommodated by a slope surface that does not exceed 1 in 20. Actually, 1 in 12 is what the code recommends as the minimum, but 1 in 20 is also acceptable. Ramps with a grade drop of 460 millimeters, or roughly 18 inches, a handrail or guard is recommended. And the handrail should extend at least a little bit past the top and bottom of the stairs and ramps and terminate by stopping at the wall. Well, from this point on, I'll be primarily talking about the National Building Code. And what does it say are the requirements for a barrier-free ramp? If you're referring to the National Building Code for residential applications, as you can see, we are looking at Part 9, which is mainly small buildings, residential construction, and more specifically in the section 9.8. This section applies to our discussion on ramps, handrails, and guard construction that we're going to get into today. So this section applies to the design, construction, interior and exterior stairs, steps, ramps, handrails, and guards. When we look at section 9.8.5 on ramps, it talks about the application. So it applies to pedestrian ramps, except ramps and barrier-free paths of travel. Ramps in a barrier-free path of travel shall conform to the requirements of Article 3.8.3.5, which is Part 3 of the Building Code for large buildings. But when we go back to the residential side, it starts with ramp width, 9.8.52, where it's going to talk about the ramp shall be not less than 43 inches in width. I will be dealing primarily with the, we'll call it the imperial, okay, feet and inches, as opposed to the metric system. But the metric system is noted there. Ramps serving a single dwelling unit or house with a secondary unit shall include their common spaces shall be not less than 34 inches in width, so 34 inches wide. Well, what about the height over ramps? Again, the code talks about, except as permitted by sentence 2, the clear height over the ramp should be not less than 87 inches in height. The clear height over ramp serving a single dwelling unit or house with a secondary suite, including the common space, should be not less than 77 inches. Again, we can move down to the ramp slope. The slope of a ramp shall be not more than 1 in 10 for exterior ramps, 1 in 10 for interior ramps servicing residential occupancies, in other words, housing. 1 in 6 for industrial occupancies, and 1 in 8 for all other occupancies. So again, defining the slope of the ramp. What about maximum rise? Where the slope of the ramp is greater than 1 in 12, the maximum rise between the floors or landings shall be 59 inches. And then we get to landings. So this subsection applies to landings, except landings for ramps and a barrier-free path of travel. Now, we see the word except. So there are exceptions, we'll call it, to the building code regulations. Landings for ramps and a barrier-free path of travel shall conform to the requirements, again, of Article 3.8.3.5, which is, again, Part 3 of the buildings, but really doesn't apply to residential buildings. But finished floors and ground surfaces with a slope not exceeding 1 in 50 at the top and bottom of the stairs or ramps shall be considered as landings. So as we go through this, you will see that in longer and more height requirements, we will probably, in most cases, require a landing space. In other words, we don't want long ramps without having landings. So kind of we'll call it a transition or a resting spot, we might call it, for the ramp construction. So let's take a look at this ramp. When I look at the pictures, first off, the one over to the upper left, we can see kind of seems a little bit, I'll call it wonky, or maybe poorly constructed rather. It seems to have a little bit of a dip in it, and also kind of seems to be sloping towards the house itself, towards that exterior wall. In the lower right, we can see sort of the guards or the railings to it. So again, when we start to take a look at the detail of it, just getting aside from what I was previously talking about building code, we can see there's large gaps and uneven spaces in the, we'll call it, guardrails. Although the handrail might be somewhat graspable, it is still a little bit iffy at best. And certainly the construction is not of the best quality. Might be something that is simply temporary. Again, when we take a look at the construction of the surface itself in the structural support for those, we'll call it, wood planks built for the ramp, doesn't seem to be a lot of structure to it, which I would say would be, with a fair amount of weight, certainly could be a potential for collapse. So again, not well constructed. So to carry on, I mentioned about the required landings. Except as provided in sentence 2 to 4, and again, this is all this legal jargon of building code that I'm quoting here. Sentence 9966, bracket 2, a landing shall be provided. And I've left out part A because it doesn't apply to us, but B, at the top and bottom of every ramp with a slope greater than 1 in 50. Where a doorway opens onto a stair or a ramp, or where a ramp opens onto a stair, and where a stair opens onto a ramp. So we can see landings are required, especially when we get over longer distances for a ramp. And certainly longer distances typically means there's a greater height difference between the grade level, ground level, and up to the actual, we'll call it, entrance door itself. Again, a landing may be omitted at the bottom of an exterior stair or ramp, provided there is no obstruction such as a gate or door with the lesser of the width of the stair or ramp, or 35 inches for stairs or ramps serving a single dwelling unit, and 43 inches for stairs or ramps not serving a single dwelling unit. What about handrails? What are the required handrails? You can see there are some exceptions, except as provided in sentence 2 to 4. Handrails shall be installed on stairs and ramps in accordance with the following table. So within the table, we can see it indicates number of sides of stairs or ramps required to have a handrail. So the location of the stair, if we take a look over into the left-hand column or ramp, within a dwelling unit or a house with a secondary suite or all other locations. And it goes handrail serving the stairs or far over to the right-hand side, which applies to us, handrail serving ramps. So we can see ramps with a width less than 1100 millimeters or to the far right, greater than 1100 millimeters. So it indicates basically 2 handrails are required. But handrails, if we take a look at sentence 3, handrails are not required for stairs and ramps serving a single dwelling unit where the ramps rise not more than 16 inches. So again, all of these, when we start thinking about it, really is formulating the requirements for the proper construction of our ramp. How about the continuity of handrails? In other words, the continuation of handrails joining and connecting to each other. Except as provided in sentence 3, required handrails shall be continuously graspable, so that we must be able to grasp onto them throughout the length of a ramps, and there are other requirements certainly for things such as stairs. If we look at sentence 2, except for stairs or ramps serving a single dwelling unit or a house with a secondary suite, including their common spaces, at least one required handrail shall be continuous throughout the length of the stair or ramp, including at the landing, except where it's interrupted by a doorway. So again, talking about the handrail requirements and the graspability requirements is noted again in the minimum building standard when we take a look at things such as the National Building Code. Again, I mentioned that provincial codes may be slightly different, and certainly we know that maybe the way things are built, perhaps even on or off, we'll call it First Nation communities, things don't always meet the code requirements. Continuity of handrails for stairs or ramps serving a single dwelling unit or a house with a secondary suite, including their common spaces. A handrail is permitted to start from a newel post or a volute installed on the bottom tread. So at the very base, start at ground level. And it talks about the termination of handrails. Handrails shall be terminated in a manner that will not obstruct pedestrian travel or create a hazard. So again, we can take a look at it, except for stairs and ramps serving only one dwelling unit or a house with a secondary suite, including their common space, at least one handrail at the sides of a stair or ramp shall extend horizontally not less than 12 inches beyond the top and bottom of each flight of the ramp. The height of handrails also is noted. So the height of handrails on stairs and ramps shall be measured vertically from the top of the handrail to, in this case, B, the surface of the ramp, floor, or landing served by the handrail. And except as provided in sentence 3, which gets into part 3, required handrail shall be 34 inches to 42 inches in height. Handrails installed in addition to required handrails need to comply with sentence 2. So this talks about the height of handrails. Let's talk a little bit about ergonomic design, which the code addresses. The clearance between a handrail and the surface behind it shall be not less than 50 millimeters or 2 inches. So again, when we talk about the graspability, although that very, very first image we looked at the ramp had a nice rail sitting on top and kind of a little bit of a side rail on the side, there technically is not 2 inches of difference as indicated required by building code. Where said surface is rough or abrasive, all handrails should be constructed continuously, graspable along the entire length with no obstruction on or above them to break a handhold. Projections into stairs and ramps. Handrails and construction below handrails, including handrail support for stair stringers, shall not project more than 100 millimeters, 4 inches into the required width of a stair or a ramp. Again, we'll get into a little more of the image in descriptive detail. Certainly, this is, as I say, the technical legal jargon that is in the building code. So this is extracted from the more recent National Building Code of Canada. How about the design and attachment of handrails? So how are they fastened? Handrails and their support shall be designed and constructed to withstand the following loads, which need to be considered to act simultaneously. So we're thinking about a person leaning against those handrails, or any weight or thing applied against it. It has to be able to withstand a push or a heavy weight being concentrated against those handrails. So it indicates here a concentrated load of not less than 0.9 kilonewtons or 202 pounds applied at any point in any direction for all handrails, and for handrails other than those serving a single dwelling unit, a uniform load of not more than 0.7 kilonewtons per meters or 157 pounds. What about guards? We talk about those little balusters or posts in between. Except as provided in sentence 2, and except at the leading edge at the top of a flight, every surface to which access is provided, including but not limited to flights of steps and ramps, exterior landings, porches and balconies, mezzanines and galleries, and raised walkways, shall be protected by a guard on each side that is not protected by a wall for the length, where the difference in elevation is greater than 24 inches, between the walking surface and the adjacent surface within 48 inches. So we can kind of take a little bit of a break here. That was a lot of building code to talk about. And certainly, if you look at it, there's actually a little bit more, but I've tried to focus on some of the main key points. So when we take a look at this image, we can see here, this is a First Nation community home. And we take a look at the construction here. And let's analyze it a little bit. So when we take a look at it, certainly it is greater than 24 inches in height. When we take a look at the actual construction, the upright, we'll call it posts, okay, main supports, don't look too bad. But we start looking at the guards. So the guards don't seem to meet building code. In fact, they do not meet building code. We can see there's been some level of protection offered in the upper part, where we can see that horizontal, we'll call it mid-height bar between the floor area up to the actual top of the posts, where we see the upper rail. So there's been some type of a little bit of a guard there. But again, if we take a look down the image towards the far left, we can see there are all those little in-between spacing balusters that we can say, well, why would it not be continued other than maybe to save costs? So again, it looks not too bad down the way, but not so great when we look at the upper part or the middle portion, and again to the far right of this ramp. So it's not continuous and it's not properly protected. Again, if we really take a look at it, this is sort of probably a modified ramp, because if we take a look over to the lower right corner, we see a couple of steps getting up to this space. So if it was someone in a wheelchair, obviously they would have to be lifted. So this should have continued down to the grade level. Or perhaps it's a person that has some issues with mobility, and they can then maybe walk up a few steps and then basically make their way up the ramp. But again, this is a fairly good example of something that certainly from a ramp point of view, it does not meet the building code. And let's face it, the building code is a minimum building standard, a minimum requirements for any building in Canada, in fact, also in the USA and so on. So again, just wanted to kind of give an example of sort of doesn't meet code type situation. Okay, let's move on a little bit. So let's talk about some of the general requirements. Let's kind of get away from so much of the building code stuff. So when we're looking at general requirements, again, a ramp with a 1 in 12 slope means that for each 1 inch of rise of the ramp, 1 foot of ramp length is required. So as an example, a ramp with a rise of 1 foot would have to be 12 feet long. So what happens if it's 2 feet? Well, now we've doubled that to 24 feet in length. And that's for the 1 in 12 slope for the ramp. And if it's getting to be 24 feet, well, that's quite a distance, and we probably will need a landing. In fact, we will need a landing in a situation like that. The surface of the ramp must have a finish that is slip resistant. Now, this isn't a code requirement. I call it a safety requirement. It just makes some common sense that certainly we saw earlier snow in the picture, and we saw snow on the ramp, and certainly people can get out and clean away the snow. But we have to think about the safety issue and the potential possibly to minimize that by having a more slip resistant surface. Down to the third point, a ramp must have a level area not less than 1.5 meters by 1.5 meters, again, 5 by 5 feet at intervals not more than 9 meters or 29.6, almost 30 feet along its length, and where there is a change in direction of 90 degrees or less. So again, depending on the configuration, we can see the need for a 5 by 5, we'll call it level area or landing. Again, the 5 by 5, this is in reference to the turning circle, we'll call it, for a wheelchair. So again, that's where that number arrives from, that 5 by 5 space. A ramp with a change in direction greater than 90 degrees must have a level area of 5 feet in width, which is actually a little bit larger. We can see almost 6 feet in length. Again, some of the general requirements when we talk about it, getting away from the building code, but still sort of inferring that it's going to be close to the building code. Where the change in elevation is greater than 9 inches, landings must have detectable warning surfaces at the top and bottom, including a change in color, texture, resiliency, and sound from surrounding surfaces. Again, when we get into the issue of barrier-free design, or more so, I did another session on universal design. Not all, we'll call it, challenges to people include just people of mobility. There could be site-related and other types of issues. So again, although again, the code doesn't say there has to be color changes and there must be texture differences. Again, this could be for someone with visual impairments, certainly distinction through color. Again, these are sort of recommended requirements for consideration for the safety of those individuals. Our second point here, handrails are required on both sides of the ramp, and except where interrupted by doorways, be continuous throughout the length of the ramp, including landings. Well, ideally, handrails would be nice on both sides of the ramp, but if we have a wall, we can also possibly attach a handrail to it, but at least there must be at least a handrail on one side for the person to use as part of their mobility and movement forward, or perhaps even downwards. Ramps not supported directly on the ground shall have all structural elements designed by a professional engineer. Again, we can see that when we take a look at ramps in general, not all of them are well built. some of them are, again, maybe for lack of financial resources, maybe corners have been cut and things aren't quite exactly, we'll say, structurally stable and or possible to create some safety concerns. Handrail height shall be between 34 to 38 inches. Again, this is a little bit of a variation from the building code, because in the building code it says 34 and perhaps up to 42 inches in height when we take a look at guards. But this is for the handrail height, so more specifically 34 to 38 inches. And horizontal extensions of handrails is not required. And again, the guard heights, 36 inches, is permitted where the difference in elevation between the landing and the ramp and the ground is less than 72 inches or 6 feet. Okay, let's get back to this particular image. Again, when we take a look at it, when I look at it, you see a nice level, we'll call it concrete pad at the base of this particular ramp. We see the main structural posts seem to be well secured and appear to be with a, I'll say, a support structurally into the ground. The framing looks really in good condition. The actual build structure looks pretty good. But if we kind of take a look, we can just kind of see that for graspability, what they did is we see there's sort of, we'll call it a 2x6 with a 2x4 with another 2x6 when we take a look at the handrail. So we're looking at the handrail detail there. So we see the 2x6 capping on top, which is nice. But on the handrail side of both of these, we can see it was a 2x6 with a 2x4 with another 2x6. So it is a reasonably graspable handrail. Not perfect, but pretty darn good. And we can see as it goes up, there's a nice gentle slope to it, going up to that 5x5 area, kind of as a landing. But it really is not really just a landing, because it pretty much levels off and maybe just goes a little bit uphill towards that front door. So again, even when we look at the front door, I see a sort of a storm door, which is okay. But then does that create another little barrier of trying to get through the door and to that insulated metal door, which is a main door behind we'll call it that aluminum storm door. But for the most part, a fairly good, view or pictorial of a barrier-free ramp. Now, if we take a look at the Ontario Building Code, this detail comes out of the Ontario Building Code, and it's by a Toronto area building code official. We can see some of these things that I talked about earlier pretty much depicted in the Ontario Provincial Building Code. And if we take a look at building codes in general, provincial building codes are really just an offshoot of the National Building Code of Canada. So again, you're going to have some slight variations. We call it depending upon the provincial flavor for their building codes. But again, this depiction helps show us some of the illustrations of what these requirements are for a barrier-free ramp. So for example, a maximum of 1 in 12 slope, a minimum of 1 in 20. We can see the height of the rail, okay, the recommended width, and the size of the actual landing itself, and so on. So again, we see some information here that could be used by the builder or the contractor or the person constructing the ramp. Moving on to the next one, this is more of a section detail indicating, we'll call it the construction, the requirements in the construction of the ramp. Remember looking back to that sort of awkward looking ramp that went up to the house that I said it was for construction. Well, again, if we take a look at it, we can see we have the column footings. So for the supports, the main supports, it shows it's basically a 4x4 minimum of wood treated posts anchored to a concrete pier into the ground. So again, proper support, proper foundations, structurally supported. And then if we take a look at it, we can see the framing. So we can see the actual framing here. So we have some substantial framing, creating basically the, we'll call it the framework, and then we can see the decking on top. We also can take a look at, when we take a look up towards that top rail and the actual graspable handrails, that it's a little bit of a modification, something that we might see on a typical interior stair. Kind of a metal bracket coming off with a round diameter handrail. So something that's very easily graspable and certainly set away from, you can actually get your fingers behind and around it to grasp onto the handrail. So again, what about the attachment to the house itself? Now, mind you, it shows in this illustration an existing solid masonry wall. Well, the same really can apply to wood frame construction. So something even with, let's say, vinyl or metal type siding. So again, some good details available. In fact, this particular illustration is a series from one of the building departments in Ontario. I believe it's in the Toronto region, and it shows a lot of good details about barrier-free ramps, garage construction, house additions, and so on. So I just wanted to kind of carry that on to you. So again, that's sort of the closing of my discussion on certainly accessibility in barrier-free ramps. It really is my intention here to try and point out that when it comes to ramps, they shouldn't be secondary in nature. They should be really thought about seriously to be properly built and constructed, to be safe and secure for the people that are going to be using them. So again, if you have any questions or comments, I look forward to it. You can see my contact here, and certainly I thank you very much for your attention and paying attention. Thank you. Bye for now.